She's just a free servant. She has been with me for 20 years. What's she gonna do? Leave? She's got nowhere to go." I overheard my husband gnash. I stood in my own doorway, holding adult diapers, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. 20 years of my life just got reduced to 5 words. She's just a free servant. Nash had no idea I was here, and he was actually laughing into the phone like my devotion to him was the punchline to some sick joke. In that moment, I felt something die inside me. Not break, die. It was the death of a woman who believed that love meant erasing yourself for someone else. The death of a woman who thought sacrifice was supposed to feel like drowning. Now, before you think I'm some heartless woman who abandoned a disabled man, hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're watching from, because this story is about to get a whole lot more twisted than you think. But here's what I need to know from you. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely was lying about who you really were to them? Because what I found out about Nash didn't just break my heart. It shattered the entire foundation of who I thought I was. See, that phone conversation wasn't the first time I'd heard Nash talk about me like that. And those 20 years of being his caregiver, they weren't what you think they were. Hi, my name is Daphne Ellens. I'm 58 years old, and I used to be a pediatric nurse who believed she could heal anything with enough love and dedication. Before that phone call destroyed everything, I was just a woman who thought she'd found her happily ever after in the arms of a man who promised to keep her safe. I met Nash when I was 28 and still carrying scars from a childhood that felt like a war zone. My mother's alcoholism had turned our house into a place where I learned to walk on eggshells, to anticipate someone else's moods, to make myself small enough to avoid the storm. Nash felt like shelter after a lifetime of being rained on. He was this confident construction foreman who could build anything with his bare hands. And God, after years of feeling fragile and unwanted, I needed someone who felt solid. He was protective in a way that made me feel precious instead of burdensome. He was strong when I felt weak, certain when I felt lost. "You don't have to worry about anything anymore," he'd whisper into my hair at night. "I've got you now." Our early marriage was like being wrapped in the warmest blanket after years of shivering. Nash literally built our dream house from the ground up. Every beam, every wall, every room, designed around the life we were going to have together. He'd come home covered in sawdust, pull me into his arms, and paint pictures with his words about the children we'd fill those bedrooms with. The Christmas mornings we'd have, the way we'd grow old together in rocking chairs on the front porch he was building by hand. I used to watch him work and think I was the luckiest woman alive. This man had chosen me. Broken, scared, damaged me, and he was building us a future with his own 2 hands. Nash convinced me to quit nursing after we married, and at the time it felt like being rescued. "Why stress yourself out with that job when I can provide for both of us?" he'd say, rubbing my shoulders after a particularly hard shift. "You deserve to be taken care of for once in your life, baby. Let me do that for you." And God, after my childhood, that sounded like paradise. To not have to fight for everything, to not have to prove my worth every single day, to just be loved and provided for. It felt like finally coming home. But the kids never came. Month after month of disappointment, of hope dying in hospital parking lots, of holding each other while we cried over what we couldn't have. The fertility treatments that drained our savings and my spirit. The baby rooms that stayed empty. The dreams that got smaller and smaller until we stopped talking about them altogether. "We don't need anyone else," Nash would say, holding me while I grieved another failed pregnancy. "We're enough, just the 2 of us. We've got each other, and that's all we need." Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. Nash's protection always came with invisible chains. His providing always meant I owed him my independence. His love always required me to be a little smaller, a little more grateful, a little more dependent on his approval. But I thought that's what real love looked like, needing each other so completely that the rest of the world became background noise. Then everything changed when Nash was 42, and I learned the difference between loving someone and disappearing for them. The accident happened on a Tuesday that started like any other Tuesday. Nash kissed me goodbye that morning, promised to be home for dinner, told me he loved me like he had 1,000 mornings before. The call came at 2:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was watching the clock, waiting for my afternoon coffee break. When the phone rang and a voice I didn't recognize said words that stopped my world. "Mrs. Elms? This is Dr. Rodriguez at University Hospital. Your husband has been in an accident." Nash fell from scaffolding, 30 feet straight down onto concrete. T12 complete spinal injury. The words the doctors used felt like they were being spoken underwater. Paralyzed, permanent, life-changing, care requirements. "He'll never walk again," Dr. Rodriguez said, his voice gentle but definitive. "He might never regain full use of his hands. He's going to need significant care for the rest of his life." I remember standing in that hospital hallway, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and feeling like I was being asked to choose between the man I loved and the life I'd known. There was no choice. There was only love, and love meant stepping up, stepping in, stepping aside from everything else that mattered. I didn't hesitate. I quit my part-time job at the clinic that same week and dove headfirst into becoming Nash's everything. I learned about spinal injuries until I could recite medical terminology in my sleep. I studied wound care, physical therapy, nutrition for paralyzed patients. I modified our entire house, ramps where there used to be steps, grab bars in every bathroom, a hospital bed in what used to be our master bedroom where we'd whispered dreams to each other in the dark. I became his nurse, his physical therapist, his cook, his cleaner, his advocate with insurance companies and doctors who sometimes looked through me like I was invisible. Those first few years were brutal, but they were also beautiful in their own devastating way. We were fighting together, Nash and me, against a world that suddenly felt hostile and inaccessible. Nash was trying so hard to get better, pushing through pain that would make grown men cry, grateful for everything I did. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he'd say, squeezing my hand with what strength he had left. "You're my angel, Daphne, my lifesaver." We were still a team, just facing a different battle than we'd expected. I thought we were writing a love story about overcoming the impossible together. But somewhere along the way, so slowly I didn't even notice it happening, something shifted. Nash's gratitude started turning into expectation. His thank you became, "You should have done it differently." My choice to care for him became his right to be cared for, and God help me if I ever suggested otherwise. The man who used to build me a life started tearing down the woman I used to be, piece by piece, day by day, until I couldn't remember who I was before I became his caregiver. And the worst part? I let him do it because I thought that's what love looked like. I thought sacrifice was supposed to hurt. I thought disappearing for someone else was the highest form of devotion. What I didn't realize was that Nash wasn't becoming a different person because of his injury. His injury was just revealing who he'd always been underneath all that protection and providing. The need for control had always been there, disguised as care. The expectation that I should be grateful for his love had always been there, disguised as generosity. And by the time I figured that out, I'd already lost 20 years of my life to a man who saw me as exactly what he told his friend, Rick, on that phone call. A free servant who had nowhere else to go. But I wasn't just a servant. I was a woman who had forgotten she used to save lives for a living. And I was about to remember why you should never underestimate someone who's been taking very detailed notes for 20 years. The erosion happened so slowly that I didn't even notice I was disappearing. It was like dying by 1,000 paper cuts, each one so small you barely feel it, but together they drain the life right out of you. It started with Nash stopping saying thank you. Just stopped. One day he was grateful for everything I did. The next day it was just expected, like breathing or the sun rising. When I'd bring him his medications, his meals, help him transfer from bed to wheelchair, silence. Not even acknowledgement. Like I was a piece of furniture that happened to have hands. The first time it happened, I thought he was having a bad day. The 10th time, I thought maybe I was being too sensitive. By the 100th time, I'd convinced myself that gratitude wasn't necessary between people who really loved each other. But it was necessary. I just didn't know. I was slowly starving for it. Then came the criticism, sharp and constant like water dripping on stone. I'd struggle with a new piece of medical equipment I'd never been trained to use, and instead of patience, I'd get, "Are you serious right now, Daphne? How hard is it to follow simple instructions? Maybe if you actually paid attention instead of daydreaming." Every mistake became evidence of my incompetence. Every difficulty became proof that I wasn't trying hard enough. Every moment of human fallibility became a character flaw that Nash felt obligated to point out for my own good. "I'm not being mean," he'd say when I'd get quiet after his criticism. "I'm trying to help you get better at this. Don't you want to be good at taking care of me?" And because I loved him, because I wanted to be good at taking care of him, I swallowed every criticism like medicine and tried harder to be perfect. When I suggested we hire some help, just a few hours a week so I could maybe see my sister or have a doctor's appointment of my own, Nash would explode like I'd suggested abandoning him on the side of the road. "Nobody does it right. You want strangers in our house touching me? You want to waste our money because you can't handle your responsibilities? After everything I've sacrificed, after everything we've been through, you want to farm me out to strangers?" Our responsibilities, our money. Like caring for him was my job description written in blood, not my choice made from love. The guilt trips became weapons, perfectly calibrated to hit every insecurity I'd ever had. When my sister Linda called from Arizona begging me to visit because she was going through a messy divorce and needed family support, Nash suddenly had mysterious symptoms that required constant monitoring. "I guess if you want to abandon me during a health crisis, that's your choice, Daphne," he'd say, his voice heavy with disappointment. "But don't expect me to be okay with it. Don't expect me to understand how you can put someone else's problems ahead of your husband's health." I never made that trip. I never made any trips. I stopped even asking. Then Nash decided his sleep was more important than mine, and I got banished to the couch like a dog who'd misbehaved. Apparently my breathing, my movement, my very existence in the bed was disturbing his rest. "You can sleep anywhere," he'd say, like it was perfectly reasonable. "I need proper sleep to heal. My sleep is medical necessity. Yours is just sleep." 20 years on a couch in my own house, listening to my husband sleep peacefully in the bed we used to share, in the room where we used to whisper our dreams to each other. My friends stopped calling because I always had an excuse. Nash needed his medication at exactly the time Sarah wanted to meet for coffee. Nash had a doctor's appointment during every lunch invitation. Nash was having a bad day every time someone wanted to see me. My family stopped inviting me to things because Nash always needed something during every holiday, every birthday, every celebration that didn't revolve around him and his care. Christmas morning became about whether Nash's pain levels would allow him to enjoy the day. My birthday became about making sure Nash felt included and comfortable. Family reunions became impossible because Nash couldn't travel, and leaving him was unthinkable. My world became 4 walls and Nash's needs, and somehow I convinced myself that's what marriage looked like. 2 people so devoted to each other that the rest of the world became irrelevant. But it wasn't 2 people. It was one person serving another person who'd forgotten how to see her as human. My health started falling apart from the stress and physical demands. My back was shot from lifting him, transferring him, positioning him. My hands were arthritic from all the physical care, the constant lifting and moving and manipulating. I was having chest pains that I was too busy to get checked, headaches that I treated with over-the-counter painkillers and ignored. But God forbid I mention being tired or in pain. Nash would remind me, with the patience of a teacher explaining something obvious to a slow child, that at least I could walk. At least I could use my hands. At least I wasn't the one dealing with real problems. My pain became selfish. My exhaustion became ingratitude. My human limitations became personal failings. Then Nash's friend Rick started coming around twice a week, and I was so desperate for Nash to have social interaction that I welcomed the visits. At first, I was happy Nash had company, someone to talk to besides me. But Rick would look at me like I was the help, not the wife. He'd make comments about how lucky Nash was to have such a dedicated nurse, and they'd both laugh in a way that made my skin crawl. Like I was some kind of service animal who'd been particularly well trained. "You've got her wrapped around your finger," Rick would say, and Nash would smile in a way that didn't reach his eyes. If you're watching this and recognizing these patterns in your own life, please hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you might save you 20 years of your life. You don't have to disappear for someone else's comfort. You don't have to earn love by erasing yourself. I started noticing Nash and Rick having conversations that would stop the second I walked into the room. They'd be talking in low voices, laughing, and then suddenly go silent when I appeared like teenagers who'd been caught planning something they shouldn't. At first, I thought they were just sharing guy talk, maybe complaining about their health issues, or talking about things they didn't think I'd understand. But the sudden silences felt wrong, loaded with something I couldn't name. So I started actually listening, not eavesdropping. I told myself, just paying attention to the conversations happening in my own house. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen making lunch, moving quietly because Nash always complained when I made too much noise during his phone calls. When I heard him talking to Rick, "I've got her so convinced she can't survive without me. 20 years of telling someone they're unemployable really does the trick." My hands stopped moving. The sandwich I was making, forgotten. Unemployable? "The best part," Nash continued, his voice casual like he was discussing the weather, "is she actually believes she has no money, like she doesn't know I've been putting away her disability payments this whole time. She thinks we're broke." "Disability payments? What disability payments?" I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the lunch I was making for a man who was discussing me like I was a particularly successful science experiment, and felt something cold settle in my chest. The conversations got worse after that. Nash would brag about how well-trained I was, how he'd convinced me that no one else would hire me, how I was too old and too out of practice to ever work as a nurse again. He'd laugh about how I slept on the couch like a dog and never complained. "She's got Stockholm Syndrome at this point," Nash told Rick one day, and they both laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. "She actually thinks this is love." Stockholm Syndrome. Like I was a hostage who'd fallen in love with my captor. Like 20 years of devotion was actually 20 years of psychological manipulation. But the conversation that broke me, the one that started with me walking out, happened when I came home early from grocery shopping. I'd forgotten my coupons and doubled back, and I could hear Nash's voice from the driveway, loud and confident because he thought he was safe. I stood outside our living room window, the woman who'd given up everything to love this man, and listened to my husband of 20 years tell his friend, "She's just a free servant at this point. She has been for 20 years. What's she gonna do? Leave? She's got nowhere to go. No money, no job skills that matter anymore. I've got it made, man." Rick laughed like Nash had told the best joke he'd ever heard. "You really did train her good. Sometimes I think about what would happen if I just stopped pretending to appreciate her. She'd still stay. What choice does she have?" 20 years of gaslighting hit me all at once like a physical blow. I wasn't his wife. I wasn't his caregiver. I was his prisoner, and he was my warden. And I'd been so busy being grateful for the privilege of serving him that I never noticed the bars on my cage. Standing outside my own house, listening to my husband mock me for loving him, I realized something that changed everything. Nash wasn't disabled by his accident. He was empowered by it. And I wasn't his devoted wife. I was his perfectly trained servant who'd forgotten she used to be a person with dreams and value and worth that existed outside of his needs. But what Nash didn't know was that some servants keep very detailed records. And some servants remember exactly how to read medical charts, insurance documents, and bank statements. And this servant was about to remind him why you should never underestimate a woman who used to save lives for a living. After I heard Nash call me a free servant, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't confront him with the righteous anger that was burning holes in my chest. Instead, I did something that 20 years of nursing had trained me to do perfectly. I made a plan. See, nurses don't panic in emergencies. We assess the situation, we strategize, and we execute with surgical precision. And Nash had just given me the biggest emergency of my life to solve. The emergency of a woman who'd forgotten she deserved to exist. But first, I had to grieve. I went into our bathroom, the bathroom I'd modified for his wheelchair, with grab bars I'd installed and a shower seat I'd researched and bought, and I looked at myself in the mirror for the first time in years. Really looked. The woman staring back at me was a stranger, hollow-eyed, thin from stress, wearing clothes that were practical rather than beautiful. When had I stopped caring about how I looked? When had I stopped looking at myself as anything other than a pair of hands that existed to serve someone else? I cried for that woman. I cried for the dreams I'd given up, the life I'd never lived, the person I'd been before I learned to disappear. I cried for 20 years of thinking that love meant erasing yourself so completely that you forgot you'd ever existed at all. And then I dried my tears, and I got to work. The first thing I did was contact my old supervisor at the hospital where I used to work. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number I'd memorized but never called. I was terrified. What if Nash was right? What if I really was unemployable after 20 years away from nursing? What if the world had moved on without me, and there was no place for a woman who'd forgotten how to be anything other than a caregiver? Daphne Ellams? Oh my God, please tell me you're calling because you want to come back. The relief in her voice was like oxygen to someone who'd been drowning. Nancy Patterson had been my supervisor when I left, and she was still there, still fighting the good fight, still saving lives. Nancy, I don't know if I can do this anymore. It's been 20 years. Medicine has changed, technology has changed. I don't know if I remember how to be a nurse. She laughed, but it was warm, not mocking. Daphne, honey, caring doesn't have an expiration date, and there's a massive nursing shortage. Hospitals are desperate for experienced nurses. Your license is still valid. I checked when I saw your name come up on caller ID, and with 20 years of hands-on caregiving experience, you're exactly what every hospital in America is looking for. But I'm 58. I'm out of practice. Nash always said. Nash is wrong, she interrupted firmly. Daphne, you're 58 with 20 years of intensive caregiving experience. You've been doing medical care, wound management, medication administration, physical therapy. Do you have any idea how valuable that skill set is? We'd hire you back immediately, full-time, at $68,000 a year. $68,000. More money than I'd seen in 2 decades. More money than Nash had convinced me I was worth. And Daphne? Nancy's voice was gentle. I don't know what's been happening in your life, but you sound like you need to remember something important. You're one of the best nurses I ever supervised. You don't become unemployable. You don't lose the ability to heal people. That's not how nursing works. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd heard Nash mock me, and felt something I hadn't felt in 20 years. Hope. Next, I called my sister Linda in Arizona. We hadn't talked in 3 years because Nash always had a crisis whenever I tried to maintain family relationships. I was so nervous my hands were shaking, so convinced that she'd moved on without me, that she'd given up on the sister who never had time for anyone but her husband. Linda, it's Daphne. I think I need help. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard her crying. I've been waiting 20 years for you to say that, she whispered. 20 years, Daphne. Pack your bags. You can stay with me as long as you need. Forever, if that's what it takes. But I don't have any money. I can't contribute to household expenses. I can't. Stop, she said firmly. Just stop. You're my sister. You don't need to earn the right to family. You just need to come home. Home. When was the last time any place had felt like home other than the place where I served Nash? What about Nash? I asked the question automatically after 20 years of putting his needs first. What about him? Daphne, has he been taking care of you the way you've been taking care of him? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Had he been taking care of me? When was the last time Nash had asked about my health, my dreams, my needs? When was the last time he'd considered my comfort or happiness as important as his own? I'll help you figure it out, Linda continued. Whatever you need, job references, a place to stay, someone to remind you who you were before you became his caregiver. I've been waiting 20 years for my sister to come back to herself. 20 years she'd been waiting. 20 years Nash had convinced me my own sister didn't really want me around. But the real investigation started when I began looking through Nash's papers. See, as his caregiver, I handled all the mail, all the paperwork, all the insurance claims, but Nash always handled the banking. Too complicated for you to worry about, he'd say whenever I asked about our finances. I'll take care of the money stuff. You just focus on taking care of me. I started going through old mail, old files, anything I could find. And that's when I discovered something that made my blood run cold and my hands shake with rage. Nash had a bank account I didn't know about. Not just any account, an account with $180,000 in it. $180,000 that he'd been hiding from me while crying poor every time I wanted to buy groceries that weren't generic brands, or replace my worn-out clothes, or suggest we hire help so I could have a single afternoon off. $180,000 while I counted coupons and wore shoes with holes in them. But that wasn't even the worst part. I found letters from the state disability office. Letters addressed to me. Letters about caregiver payments that I'd apparently been receiving for 15 years. Payments for being Nash's full-time caregiver. Payments that were supposed to come to me in my name, for my work. Nash had been intercepting those letters, depositing those checks, and putting that money into his secret account. For 15 years, the state had been paying me almost $1,200 a month to take care of my husband. And Nash had been stealing every penny while telling me we were broke. I sat in our kitchen at 2 a.m. looking at bank statements that showed deposits of caregiver support, LMs, DLMs, going into an account I'd never seen. And I realized something that changed everything. Nash hadn't just been emotionally abusing me. He'd been financially abusing me. He'd been committing fraud. And he'd been doing it with money that was legally mine. Money I'd earned with 20 years of unpaid labor. Money that was meant to compensate me for giving up my career, my independence, my life, to take care of him. That's when the nurse in me took over completely. The woman who used to save lives, who used to make life and death decisions, who used to advocate for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. I called the bank and discovered that as Nash's wife, I had legal access to that account. I transferred $90,000, exactly half, into a new account in my name only. My money. Money I'd earned with 20 years of stolen labor. I arranged a job interview with the hospital in Phoenix for the following week. I booked a one-way flight to Arizona. I found a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse and fraud, because that's what this was, fraud. But most importantly, I called Adult Protective Services and reported Nash's care situation. Not to get him in trouble, but to make sure he'd be properly assessed for his actual care needs versus what he'd been claiming he needed. Because here's what I'd figured out. Nash wasn't as helpless as he pretended to be. Those disability payments were based on him needing full-time care. But I'd watched him do things when he thought I wasn't looking. I'd seen him reach things he claimed he couldn't reach, transfer himself when he thought I was outside, even stand for brief moments when he was angry enough. Nash had been playing up his disability to keep me trapped and to keep those payments coming. And I had documentation of all of it, because nurses keep very detailed records. The plan was perfect. Nash would wake up the next morning thinking he was talking to his trained servant. Instead, he was about to meet the woman who remembered she used to save lives for a living. And this time, the life I was saving was my own. Everything was set. I just had to wait for the right moment to execute. And that moment came the very next day, when I overheard Nash having that final conversation with Rick about how I was just a free servant with nowhere to go. Turns out, Nash was wrong about a lot of things. But he was especially wrong about where I could go. I could go anywhere I wanted. With my own money, to my own job, to my own life, and I was about to prove it. So there I was, standing in that doorway with those diapers, watching Nash's face turn white as he realized I'd heard every word of his conversation with Rick. The moment I dropped those diapers in his lap and said, "Good luck, Nash," 20 years of manipulation tactics kicked into overdrive. But for the first time in 2 decades, they didn't work on me. Because I wasn't the same woman who'd walked into this house 28 years ago believing that love meant disappearing. First came the begging, and it was masterful. Nash had perfected this performance over 20 years. "Daphne, wait. I didn't mean it like that. You know I love you. I was just venting to Rick. You know how guys talk. It didn't mean anything." His voice broke just right. His eyes filled with tears that looked genuine. His hands reached for me with the perfect amount of desperation. If I hadn't heard him laughing about training me like a dog, it might have worked. I kept walking toward the door. Then came the promises. Frantic and detailed. "I'll change. I'll appreciate you more. We can get help. We can hire someone. Please don't do this. I'll go to therapy. I'll work on myself. I'll be better." 20 years too late, Nash was offering me everything I'd begged for, everything I'd cried for, everything he'd told me we couldn't afford or didn't need. I reached for my car keys. Then came the manipulation that had worked for 20 years, the guilt trips that used to send me back to his side, apologizing for even thinking about my own needs. How can you abandon a disabled man? What kind of person does that make you? "I can't survive without you. You're all I have, after everything I've been through, after everything we've been through together." He was crying now, real tears. And for a moment, just a moment, I felt that familiar pull. That voice in my head that said, "Good women don't leave. Good women sacrifice. Good women put everyone else's needs first." But then I remembered. She's just a free servant, Rick, has been for 20 years. I turned around one last time and looked at this man who'd stolen 20 years of my life, who'd convinced me that love meant erasing myself, who'd made me forget that I was a person who deserved to exist for my own sake. I spoke in the same calm voice I used to use when explaining procedures to scared patients, when delivering news that would change everything, when advocating for people who couldn't advocate for themselves. "Nash, I've transferred my half of the money you hid from me. Adult Protective Services will be here in 2 hours to assess your actual care needs. Your insurance covers home health aides. You can afford to pay someone who actually is just an employee." His face went from panic to rage so fast it was like watching a mask slip. "You can't take that money. That's fraud. I'll call the police. I'll tell them you're stealing from a disabled man." "Go ahead," I said, and my voice was steady in a way that surprised even me. "Explain to them how you've been stealing caregiver payments meant for me for 15 years. I'm sure they'll be very interested in that conversation. I have all the documentation, Nash. All of it." Then Nash played his final card, the one that had kept me trapped for so long I'd forgotten there was a world outside this house. "If you leave me, I'll hurt myself. I'll kill myself. You'll have my death on your conscience. Is that what you want? To be responsible for killing your husband?" That's when my nursing training really kicked in. 20 years of medical knowledge, of crisis management, of dealing with patients who threaten self-harm. "Nash, I've already arranged for welfare checks. The county will monitor your safety every few hours. But your threats to hurt yourself are exactly why Adult Protective Services needs to evaluate whether you're competent to live alone or if you need psychiatric intervention." The look on his face was pure shock. For 20 years, the threat of self-harm had been his nuclear option, the thing that always brought me back to his side. He'd never expected me to call his bluff with professional competence. I walked outside to load my single suitcase into my car, just one suitcase. After 20 years of marriage, everything that actually belonged to me, everything that was truly mine and not just tools for serving him, fit in one suitcase. That should have been my first clue. That's when Nash started screaming from the doorway, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "She's abandoning me. She's leaving a disabled man to die. Someone help me. Call the police. She's stealing my money." The neighbors started coming outside. The same neighbors who'd watched this drama unfold for 20 years. Mrs. Peterson from next door, who'd seen Nash yell at me in the yard when I moved too slowly with his wheelchair. Tom and Sarah from across the street, who'd watched me carrying groceries and medical supplies while Nash sat in his wheelchair, criticizing how I loaded the car. The Williams family from the corner house, who'd heard Nash screaming at me through our windows on his bad days. They'd all seen Nash treat me like hired help. They'd all heard him berate me for not being fast enough, good enough, competent enough. They knew exactly what was happening. Nash was still screaming, "She's stealing my money. She's abandoning her disabled husband. Someone call someone. This is elder abuse." But Mrs. Peterson just shook her head and went back inside. Tom gave me a thumbs up from across the street. Sarah called out, "Good for you, honey." The Williams family actually started clapping. 20 years of watching a woman disappear, and they were celebrating her resurrection. I looked at Nash one last time from my car window. This man who'd convinced me I was nothing without him, who'd stolen my money while telling me I was unemployable, who'd made me sleep on a couch in my own house while he spread out in the bed we used to share. I said the words that ended 20 years of servitude. "Nash, for 20 years you convinced me I was lucky to serve you. Today I remembered. You were lucky to be served by me. That luck just ran out." The last thing I saw in my rearview mirror was Nash in his wheelchair, alone on the porch of the house he'd built with his own hands, screaming at a woman who was no longer listening. I drove away, listening to Nash scream behind me, and for the first time in 2 decades, I turned the radio up loud and sang along to songs I'd forgotten I loved. My voice was rusty from years of only speaking when spoken to, but it was mine. 6 months later, I'm working as a pediatric nurse at Phoenix Children's Hospital, and every single day I remember why I fell in love with nursing in the first place. I take care of sick children who thank me for helping them, not grown men who think I owe them my existence. I use my medical knowledge to heal people who appreciate being healed. I'm living with my sister Linda temporarily, but I'm looking at apartments. Real apartments with my name on the lease, paid for with my own salary. Apartments with bedrooms where I'll sleep in a bed, my own bed, every single night. Linda and I stay up late, talking like we did when we were kids, before I learned that my voice only mattered when it was serving someone else's needs. She tells me about the sister she missed, the phone calls she wanted to make but didn't because she knew Nash would find a way to make me hang up. She tells me about family gatherings where they set a place for me at the table, even though they knew I wouldn't come. "We never stopped hoping you'd remember who you were," she tells me one night, and I cry for all the years I lost, all the birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons I missed, because I thought love meant making myself smaller and smaller until I disappeared completely. And Nash? Oh, Nash is fine. The state investigated the caregiver fraud, and Nash had to pay back some of the money. Adult Protective Services determined he needed minimal assistance, not full-time care. His disability payments were adjusted accordingly. Turns out, when professionals evaluate your actual needs, instead of taking your word for it, the truth comes out. And me? I wake up every morning in a bed, not on a couch. I eat meals when I'm hungry, not when someone demands to be fed. I have conversations with my coworkers about books and movies and politics, not just medical symptoms and care schedules. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.